Ola to ma oko.
Może niespodziankę jej zrobimy. Może aparat.
Mamy teraz na to pieniądze?
Spokojnie.
And they can even greatly vary the combat experience during boss fights in general in really cool ways. But generally, often, it just feels like you're playing in co-op with a strange-looking companion, and it works really well. I haven't delved into the game's code or anything, but I wouldn't be surprised if bosses receive the same AI tweaks and summons receive the same generalized damage reduction as when you play through a boss fight in co-op. It really seems like From Software just wanted a system where they could have players who aren't playing in co-op receive the same gameplay benefit as players who are playing in co-op. Furthermore, there are a lot of these summons, and many of them do different things. Some of them may be rotten dogs that inflict rotting damage that slowly builds over time, and considering some bosses are particularly weak to this rotting damage, it can be very, very useful. Others could be tanky humanoids that are primarily meant for absorbing damage while you dish it out, and others are meant to be more versatile and well-rounded, such as the Mimic tier, which has received much attention since the game's launch because it is extremely powerful when leveled up properly. And I will say the reason that the Mimic tier went viral in so many TikToks and people saying it was so broken, it ruins the game, blah, blah, blah. It's because some people posted TikToks and videos of them using these Mimic tiers to destroy early game bosses.
Co ty nie
Basically, they
śpisz?
summoned it and then
Znaczy
let
nie
it just
śpisz,
run
kurwa,
off
nie
and kill a
pracujesz?
boss single-handedly. The player didn't even have to deal any damage at all.
Zapojesz
Now, I
60,
tested this
jest
myself where
130.
I started New Game Plus and then used a plus 10
Już jest
Mimic
ogarnięte.
tier to go and fight, say,
Wiesz?
the Tree Sentinel. And I had less dramatic results than
Do
most of
pracy.
these TikToks that went viral. So what it seems like happened to me is one of two things. Either
Nie za często
From
ta
Software
przerwa.
nerfed the Mimic tier in between when that TikTok was filmed and when I was experimenting with it, which is possible, you never know. Or they were simply so overpowered for that early game boss in New Game Plus that it never stood a chance. Like, they were so overpowered for it that it was going to be ridiculous whether the Mimic tier was the one dealing the damage or the player was dealing the damage.
Napierdalać, a
I
nie.
think it's possibly a combination of the two, but it just goes to show you don't trust everything you see on the internet. Regardless, I
Poza
think these
przerwa.
summons are really cool. Sure, some of them seemed extremely powerful when the game first launched, only to receive serious reductions in their potency later, but I think they are still fun to use, and it's really refreshing to see something new and a crazy different way of dealing with boss fights from these developers who are experts in boss fights. And to all of those people who are like, no,
Twoje
summons
przerwy
need
idealnie
to
się
go away,
wklejają w
summons
momenty,
need to
kiedy ja
disappear, they're
odpalałem
easy mode,
streama
blah,
tam
blah,
przy
blah. For
10:13.
one, you are in the vast minority of players. I surveyed thousands of you. Very few people said
No ja
that
mam
they need to
wakacje.
get rid of these things. Most players really, really like summons. And
Ja mam
secondly,
wakacje
the
w tej
developers
chwili.
seem to like summons so much
Sobotę na
that
obóz
not only
jadę.
did they introduce them into their latest game, which I'm sure took lots of development time and practice and effort, but also they built an entire boss fight around summons in the form of Radon, where you can just like run around and summon a handful of different characters to help you in the boss fight. They seem pretty proud of this system, and it works really well. It's like a weird sort of Pokemon thing, and I like it. You know, you collect these summons, you level them up, and then you send them out to help you in a boss fight. It's cool, and the only thing I could say is that I would hope that in the next game that we get, there are more varied types and archetypes of summons and more customization options. You know, if it was something like you could actually collect different enemies or mini bosses that you fought to help you in summon form, and then you can give them different weapons and things, and they basically become like AI companions that you can summon to help you with big boss fights. I think that could be really, really cool.
Żebym
I'd love to
odpalić
see it.
jeden?
As for
Nie.
co-op, it works almost as well as you would expect. The one
Ostatnio
problem
dużo
that I
było
did
grane,
encounter
więc mam ochotę
regularly was
pograć w
that
inną
there
gierkę.
were some major issues getting friends to
Nie
actually
ma co
summon
wiesz.
into the world. It was odd. We would be standing
Się
in a place where
przepalić.
you can summon each other. I would throw down my sign to summon somebody into my
Za
world, but it
dużo.
wouldn't display on their end. But when they set down their sign to summon me into their world, it would show up just fine. And then when I
Ja nie mogę
restarted
grać
the game,
długo w
it
jedną
was
gierkę.
working the way you would expect. Just
Dlatego
little
chciałem,
things
żebyśmy
like
co
that
2
where
tygodnie
it
grali ten
didn't
wyścig, żeby
generally
troszkę
work
odpocząć.
exactly how you would expect it to. There seemed to be occasional bugs and slight headaches. But once we were properly summoned into the other player's world, I never
Gdyby nie
really
było.
encountered any major issues. No server issues, no connection drops, nothing. It worked really, really well. Zero lag. Nothing but good things to say about it. On the whole, co-op works really, really well. I think it really added to my overall experience with the game in a positive way. There's not much else to say about it other than it's really fun to play Elden Ring with your friends. Seeing how their loadouts work and their weapon choice works in combination and tandem with your choices, it's really, really interesting. It's not quite on the level of something like Monster Hunter World or Monster Hunter Rise, where you're able to fling each other into the air, reposition together, and use combat moves in tandem, but it's still really, really good. If you haven't tried co-op in Elden Ring, I highly recommend that you give it a shot, because it's pretty fun. Especially in some of those big name boss fights, it's extremely exhilarating to work together with somebody to overcome the challenge. Oh, costume change, how cool is that? Now I want to discuss the world design. After all, exploration is one of the major elements of this game's gameplay loop. I actually already made a big video about the 40-second rule of Elden Ring's open world, and all of the data that I collected helped prove my point that Elden Ring follows in one of the same design trends as most of the other major successful open world games of the last decade. Now, instead of just rehashing the whole thing, I'm instead just going to show you the important parts of that video to make it easier for everybody. If you're one of the 250,000 people that have already seen the video, first of all, thank you for watching that. I appreciate you. And secondly, this might seem a little bit redundant, but it's a good refresh. So here we go. Today we're going to be doing an experiment, and it's something I've done for other games like Red Dead Redemption 2, Breath of the Wild, The Witcher 3, Skyrim, all sorts of open world games that I find their worlds to be relatively compelling. And the premise is pretty simple at its core. So back in late 2017, a documentary was made on the development of The Witcher 3, and specifically how they designed the open world. It's a no-clip documentary called Designing the World of The Witcher 3. Phenomenal. Highly recommend you check it out. Truly fantastic. And in the video, some of the designers discuss how they made the world feel dense enough to be interesting, but also large enough and with enough room to breathe that it didn't feel oppressive or like it was just a collectathon. And this is something we as gamers, I think, take for granted a lot of the time. We just play through an open world game and assume that it's balanced because it is. We don't pay attention to the minutia of it, but a lot of the time there are very strict rules, guidelines, and techniques that the developers have used to create these worlds and make them feel alive and interesting to boot. The team that put together The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt used something they called internally the 40-second rule. And it's very simple to understand, but to explain it quickly and efficiently, I'm going to use the greatest tool given to man since... That is, of course, MS Paint. I know it's 2022. This is the best we got, people. Deal with it. We're going with it. So the premise is pretty simple. The player character can only travel a set distance within 40 seconds or so. Let's represent that distance with this line. Let's say this is just running on the ground freely as Geralt. No horse or mount. That'll complicate things a little bit, but for basic demonstration purposes, this line represents how far you can run in 40 seconds. The 40-second rule of open world game design is pretty simple. All it says is that within this travel time or in this distance, you should hit something interesting that diverts your attention, pulls you away, in effect, something that's going to try to distract you from where you're going. A great way to demonstrate this would be, for instance, if you have destination A and destination B and you're traveling between these two places, if something interesting pops up, it should try to divert you away from that objective. If you're just trying to run somewhere, something should happen that's interesting enough that your attention gets pulled off. And you'll notice this in all sorts of open world games where you're trying to just run somewhere but you keep getting distracted. That's what this is. Game designers want that to happen because it makes the world feel more alive and more interesting, because instead of just running from point A to point B, you're actually doing more things as you travel. It's about the journey, not just the destination, right? And how game designers will use this is they will take that 40-second travel distance, draw a circle around the starting point, and try to place things along the circumference of the circle. So for example, if we start at location X right here, that's where the player is standing when we're designing the world. This is where we assume he's going to be. If we then go and draw out that distance, say 30 seconds, we can travel this far. We want to make sure that no matter which direction we travel, something interesting will happen. And the way we can demonstrate that is with a circle. The whole premise of this, though, is that along the circumference of this circle, circle, we should have something interesting that diverts the player's attention scattered along it. And if this is roughly 40 seconds, I don't know if this is exactly the distance you could run in 40 seconds, maybe close, maybe it needs to be bigger, I'm not sure. But you could see that along the circle, there are things very closely placed within that range. In reality, 40 seconds might be closer to this, in which case you can see exactly how this type of thing lines up from the fulcrum point in the middle, where you have caves scattered around treasure, you have combat encounters close by, fast travel posts, you have herbs that you can collect, all sorts of things that are placed along the circumference of this circle. So within 40 seconds of exploring, something new will happen. Now, I've tested this with a bunch of different games. Most of them tend to follow 30 to 40 seconds, especially the games that are really good and have compelling open world. Breath of the Wild, Skyrim, The Witcher 3, all fall into this range of roughly 30 to 40 seconds in between moments of interest. A game like Red Dead Redemption 2, on the other hand, stretched it all the way to 80 seconds between moments of interest that diverted your attention, which encouraged the same feeling of the world being huge and also very desolate and empty, considering it was very wild and open in that map. But that worked with that game and that setting, so it was okay. But the latest open world game to release that's kind of captivated the audience's hearts and minds is Elden Ring. And it was the first real foray into a full-fledged open world for FromSoft, at least in any meaningful sense. You could say Sekiro was sort of open-ended, you could go different places, but it was still very linear in terms of design. This is full open world, explore to your heart's content, do whatever you want. And it's fantastic, for the record. So I did what any well-adjusted YouTuber does. I pulled out an Excel spreadsheet and a stopwatch and got to work. For the record, this is really subjective, okay? Like, I'm not trying to claim that this is some sort of scientific objective study with irrefutable results, okay? This is my results after my own experience and my gameplay. Your results may vary. I don't know why you'd want to do this yourself. I don't know why I do it either, other than that some of you guys find it really interesting. But for the record, these are very subjective results. That being said, how this worked is that I played through Elden Ring for a set period of time, about 5 to 6 hours, roughly speaking. And during that time, I wasn't trying to hunt down bosses. I wasn't trying to follow the guiding light to get through the main story. I was focused on exploration, okay? Unadulterated, purely free exploration. And then what I did is I watched back through the recording, and every time something diverted my attention away, I would stop the time and record how long it had been since the last thing pulled my attention away from just exploring. And then after that encounter was done, after I had collected whatever object or dealt with the enemy, or if it was a boss after I had killed the boss or got fed up with it, I then restarted the timer once I began exploring again, and I stopped the timer when I found something else that was interesting. And that's basically how this worked. I timed it out and narrowed everything down to a collection of roughly 223 individual entries and moments of interest over the course of this like 5 3/4 hour session. So then what I did is I put all of the times in between moments of interest into a spreadsheet, into one column. I labeled each event in order that it occurred, and then I charted it. And then I ran a regression analysis and ended up with this lovely spreadsheet right here. I love it when we have a hypothesis, specifically that a good open world tends to float around 40 seconds in between moments of interest, and then we test it and it ends up being confirmed. That's exactly what happened here. You can see the times were spread out and it ends up looking quite random in between most moments of interest, ranging anywhere from like 7-8 seconds between things that pulled my interest. Maybe it was an item and then I round the corner, look around, and I find an enemy close by. It could be something like that. Or these big stretches of like 80 seconds where it was just a big open field and I'm just riding and taking in the views, looking up at the vistas, and perhaps my attention is not specifically on finding things on the ground or anything, but it's just taking in the world and the beauty that they've created here. But this is all about trends. Individual instances aren't that important. It's about the average, because that tells us roughly what the actual distance is on a rolling average across the world itself. Because in some areas, the time will be less because it's more narrow. narrow, and other areas will be much more spread out because the areas are really open. It's the average that we care about. And sure enough, the average comes out to roughly 37.18 seconds in between events of interest that divert your attention, which is exactly what we would predict if this game was adhering to the 40-second rule of open world games, which is that in pretty much every game I've ever tested that has a compelling and interesting open world, they fall into this guideline. Whether it's Fallout New Vegas, Skyrim, The Witcher 3, they're all in this realm, and there's a reason for it. It's because this is what players find captivating and interesting and compelling, and this is what drives them to keep exploring. For whatever reason, our little monkey brains are just trained to really want to continue exploring when there's something interesting every 30 to 40 seconds. If there's too much time in between moments of interest, we kind of daze off and lose focus, and we find it boring and empty. And if it's too tightly packed together, we sort of get overwhelmed, and it feels too much like a video game, and it doesn't feel like an actual world worth exploring. All of these other stats aren't particularly important for us. I mean, we can look at the standard error, the coefficients, p-values, t-stats, f-values, what the percentile of each output was, what the standard residuals were. For an experiment, quote unquote, like this, those numbers are not really useful because, I mean, again, this isn't like a scientific thing. This is just a YouTuber with a stopwatch and a spreadsheet going through and trying to find out roughly how much time is between moments of interest. And so in that pursuit, I think it's pretty compelling. At least I think it is. I mean, I think it is. I think it is. But that's about it. I mean, we would predict that Elden Ring, being a compelling open world game, would have things spaced out roughly about 40 seconds because that's what most compelling, interesting open worlds have it spaced out at. And sure enough, when we test it, that's what we see. Now, one of the other things we have to mention when we are discussing the open world traversal and exploration in a game such as Elden Ring is the effect that the community has on the experience for most players. You see, it's common in many open world games that players will eventually start looking online for where the best items are, where there are powerful weapons, interesting locations that hold unique set pieces, or even items, or even something fun like Easter eggs. Especially in the age of TikTok, it's increasingly common to become aware of some of these special locations, even if one isn't seeking them out, because you'll simply be browsing your feed and you will see one of these videos come across your screen explaining how to get one of the best items in the game. And just like that, even though you didn't mean to, you've been exposed to a spoiler of where you can find something very valuable. Now, this has been true for most games in the last decade, especially since everybody pretty much got cell phones in the last 15-20 years. But it's especially true for Elden Ring. I can't think of the last time there was so much content that flooded social media surrounding a singular game release. It was probably Red Dead Redemption 2, if I'm being honest, because back then when the game released, it was also everywhere. Even South Park did an episode about the game, which was really, really funny. Now, I, and it seems many others, were initially frustrated by having our feeds just flooded with content on this game because so much stuff was spoiled. I felt like I couldn't be on social media at all without having things shown to me that I didn't want to be shown, or without having cool locations suggested or cool items shown off before I naturally found them. I'm one of those players who likes discovering these things organically while meandering around the wastes, but you would be hard-pressed to completely avoid any spoilers surrounding item locations or bosses in Elden Ring over the last few months. But I eventually had my mind opened up to something I hadn't considered before, and it was when I was speaking to my brother-in-law Quincy. Hi Quincy, if you ever see this. I was speaking with him at one point in the few weeks after the game had launched, and he put forward an idea that I hadn't considered before. Specifically, that the community discussion of the game is in and of itself a feature of these From Software games. In other words, one of the things that makes From Software games so cool is the community. The fact that everybody can work together to figure out the best strategies for certain bosses and areas. And the fact that From Software will withhold so much information from the player, especially narratively and in terms of structure, such as where you're supposed to go next, all suggest that they are trying to encourage the community to make up the difference. The developers could have put in a simple step-by-step quest guide with markers to show where players are supposed to go next after every single boss fight, but they didn't do that. And if you've played any of the other games, the mere thought of such an addition probably is enough to make you cringe. And that's because the wandering and exploration is part of the experience these games have to offer. And for many, the community is part of it too. The community that helps them navigate these meandering passageways. So while I used to be very frustrated by the lack of guidance and seeming obsession with vague storytelling that From Software puts forward, I've actually come to appreciate it in a new light. If you are exploring the world of Elden Ring and the lands between, I don't think there's anything wrong with looking up where you should collect, for example, larval tears. These things are necessary to respec your character after you defeat Renala, Queen of the Full Moon. Most players will probably have a few of these in their inventory by the time they defeat her, but as the game goes on, and if you're like me, you like experimenting with different loadouts, you'll probably be using a lot of these tiers. While I would have preferred that respecking were free, if I'm being honest, or perhaps it had a rune cost or something that was a little easier to collect, and also that there were other systems in place, such as hot swappable loadouts akin to Monster Hunter World, I'm willing to work with this system, and I think it works better than it has in previous games. You know, at least you can respec your character if you want to. A lot of other games like this from Software and from many other developers too, just kind of say, oh well, if you don't like the way your character turned out, you're gonna have to wait till New Game Plus, or you're just gonna have to start over entirely. I personally see nothing wrong with looking up where to collect these tiers, which is my broader point here. Some purists might say that it's cheap or unfair to look up where these items are, but based on my survey of all of you, it seems like the overwhelming majority of players do this and don't seem to have a problem with it. It's not like players are looking up the item code to give it to themselves through console commands. You look up where these items are located, and usually you have to defeat an enemy or a group of enemies before you even get to it. And this, to me, suggests that the developers were aware that a lot of players would be doing this, so they tried to counterbalance the ease of discovery with the difficulty in acquiring. Like we discussed earlier with trying to balance out the ease of acquiring high-level gear or loot. In this case, the larval tiers have this applied, but the weapons and armor pieces, which are, I would argue, more valuable, don't have this careful consideration of being guarded by enemies or placed in really difficult to find areas. There are some weapons that are hard to find, but writ large, it's mostly just a matter of sprinting to the area where they're held, grabbing it, and bugging out. At least when we're talking about some of the most broken weapons in the game. There are some weapons that are locked behind specific boss encounters, or behind doors that are only accessible after boss fights, but writ large, for the weapons that were really broken on launch day, they were pretty easy to acquire. My broader point is just simply that I think it's totally okay if you want to look up an online guide to figure out where you need to go to collect something like a larval tier, especially because the developers took the careful consideration to go in and place them intentionally behind boss encounters, behind enemies, in places that you basically have to earn the larval tier even if you know where it is. I just wish they had done this for every valuable item in the game instead of just a few weapons and then the larval tiers. I wish that they had put more intention behind where they placed every item. Now, we briefly touched on level scaling and, of course, on respecking your character with those larval tiers. So let's discuss leveling in general now. The leveling system in Elden Ring is pretty similar to their past games. You start with a pre-built class, or you construct it from scratch. You build out your character in the character creator, which is fun, but doesn't really matter because you're going to be underneath a ton of armor for the majority of the game, but nonetheless, it's a nice addition, and the ability to customize your character is fun. As you play through the game and acquire runes, which, as I said earlier, are this game's version of XP, souls, or blood echoes from previous games, you will spend them to level up your character, with each level raising the amount of runes necessary to level up again. By the end of the game, you will need over 100,000 runes for a single level. And this is all par for the course and very normal for From Software games and action RPGs alike. As you level up, you'll be able to take on higher level enemies, which are much more difficult but also have higher rune payouts, which is good because you'll need more runes to continue leveling up as you grow in strength. And again, this is very, very normal, nothing strange about this. The frustration comes in that as you level up higher and higher, the return on investment for each point drops, eventually capping out almost entirely with a hard cap, at which point it's basically useless to continue putting points into that column. Again, this is par for the course when it comes to From Software games. Hard caps and soft caps are nothing new. Dark Souls 3 had soft caps and hard caps within the overarching range of applicable points, and beyond blind experimentation or outside research, you weren't informed of when these soft caps or hard caps were actually hitting. Now, I haven't done a survey or anything to figure out what most players think of these caps, but after asking a good number of my friends, most of them were aware that there were caps that basically reduced the value of points as you leveled higher and higher, but they thought of it as more of a logarithmic scale. They didn't think it was multiple soft and hard caps in tandem as you level up. The more you know. But what are these caps in Elden Ring specifically? Well, they vary per stat that you're looking at. So it's going to be different for vigor, for endurance, strength, intelligence, dexterity. All of it's going to be different. You see, all of these can be leveled up to level 99, but you don't want to max them out beyond these hard caps, otherwise your return on investment is basically nil. Now in Elden Ring, you can fill up your vigor to level 40, gaining about 26 health points per level applied. Once you cross that level 40 barrier though, it drops to 13 points added per level. And then once you hit level 60, you'll hit a hard cap, at which point it will drop once again to only 5 HP added per level. To offer a counter example, in Bloodborne, for its vitality stat, that had a soft cap of 30 compared to Elden Ring's 40, and Bloodborne had a hard cap of 50 as opposed to Elden Ring's hard cap of 60. Or in Dark Souls 3, you hit an early hard cap at level 44 in vigor, at which point you only gained 10 HP from subsequent levels up. And all this really tells us is that, for one, Bloodborne was a much shorter game, and the amount of levels they expected you to be applying over the course of a regular run of the game weren't as high as in a game such as Elden Ring. Elden Ring, most players that I looked at were anywhere between level 80 and level 130 by the time they finished the game. Which makes sense, especially if players are specializing in a couple of key skills. They probably are reaching about that hard cap for vigor and for endurance, and then if they're specializing in a strength weapon for strength, and by the time the game's over, they've pretty much met that hard cap for all of the important stats that they're concerned with. And then as they continue on through New Game Plus or New Game 2 Plus, they're going to be headed higher and higher towards 99, but there will be majorly diminished returns on every level applied. Now, granted, this can usually be figured out with experimentation, and most players will get a feel for it pretty quickly because they'll notice that once they reach a certain point, they apply skill points and they no longer see reasonable returns. So they'll simply stop applying them to vigor, for example, and start applying them elsewhere where they see a bigger benefit. We've all done this when leveling up our characters. We mess around with the levels a little bit, aware that we want to put the points into vigor, endurance, or strength, and then we try applying the points in different ways to see what will have the most impactful effect immediately. I just think that all of this is unnecessarily vague when these thresholds are crossed, that is. The only way we figure this out is when players work together in forums to calculate exactly what these soft caps and hard caps are. Keeping this unknown and unclear for the player doesn't make the game any better, and proof positive of this is that hardcore fans will simply seek out this information as soon as it's available online. They'll do this because it helps them build characters more effectively. If the developers just provided this information up front, perhaps with a symbol-based system where once you reach the first soft cap, a small minus sign shows up next to the stat indicating a reduced impact, and then once you hit the second soft cap or hard cap, it shows 2 or more minus signs. Something as simple as that would indicate to the player that they've reached the first soft cap for that stat. And again, the only reason I'm saying a system like this would probably be necessary is because these caps are different for each stat. Some of them have 2 caps, 1 soft, 1 hard. Some of them have 4. Some have as many as 6 based on the research done over on the Elden Ring wiki. They probably set this system up this way because they noticed that a linear stat system led to players growing increasingly overpowered at increasingly high rates of speed. So instead, they go with this logarithmic system, which results in players mostly landing around the same strength level by the end of the game, which I'm sure it makes it much easier to balance everything, but considering how unbalanced the rest of the combat system is, it doesn't seem to be working properly. Again, this is part of the reason I wanted to wait for the dust to settle before putting this video out, and it was primarily because diehard fans of this type of game and of this studio find it really difficult to admit faults on the parts of the developers or issues with how they approach the basic combat design and action RPG elements. But in this case, there were so many countless issues with weapon balancing, boss weakness, and performance issues. I think it's impossible to argue that all of this was intentional. It seems as though they just lost control of it at some point. And once again, it's made all the more clear by the developers' constant attempts to rebalance the game after it initially launched. You gotta give them credit, they were willing to try to get the game where it needed to be, but it still doesn't change the fact that they were repairing something that was broken, which makes it pretty clear that this wasn't in its proper condition at launch. But to be as clear as I possibly can, I think this system probably works just fine. It just doesn't work well in tandem with the weapon and armor systems that we have in Elden Ring. It's like there are too many moving parts and they can't keep track of everything at the same time. They built these weapon and armor systems on top of a solid foundation in the form of the character builder and the stat systems they've used for their previous games, but because the weapons are so inconsistent in their balancing, it ends up breaking and crumbling under its own weight. And then players grow all the more frustrated and confused because there are multiple soft and hard level caps as they're trying to scale their character for the weapon that might be broken or might not be depending on when it was patched last. And then they feel like they don't know what they're doing because everything is so convoluted and not properly or clearly explained to them. But once again, maybe this is part of the game. Maybe this is a feature, the fact that it's not clear and that the only way you can figure this out clearly and min-max your character is by looking up the wiki and using the assistance and help of other gamers and fans of these types of games. Maybe that's a feature and not actually a problem. Who knows? I'm not sure, but I think it would have been very easy to address. Now, one of the other suggestions and recommendations that I made just a few moments ago was that they introduce hot swappable loadout options into these games, because I think if any game needed it, Elden Ring is it. I've always thought that this would be really interesting in a game like Dark Souls or Bloodborne and now Elden Ring, but especially in the latter, the vast variety of weaponry, armor types, and playstyles, it's truly impressive and it is a major selling point of the game. It's something that the developers should be very proud of, and they should want the players to experiment with all of these abilities and playstyles as much as possible. And I think they did try to offer a way to do this with the larval tiers and the respecking. It's actually fairly easy to find these tiers, and by the end of the game, it's very reasonable to suggest that you could have respec'd 5 to 10 times by the time you see the credits roll. But with these hot swappable loadout options, I want to go a little bit more in depth, and I would like to see something that streamlines this process a little more. Again, it's not about simplifying the process or dumbing it down, it's about streamlining it so there isn't as much wasted time on the part of the player, and so that it's easier for the player to take on bosses in different playstyles without having to go into the menus and spend 10 minutes applying different weapons and then finding a larval tier for 20 minutes and then fast traveling back into the library to talk to Rena to respec and then going all the way back to the boss arena to try and take on the boss again. I think having the ability to simply pop into your inventory, perhaps spend 25,000 runes or something to instantly swap to your magic build or a build with a colossal greatsword or a build that's made with bleed damage, I think could add a lot of really positive dynamic action into the already robust combat system here. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it is. It's something that Monster Hunter has been doing for a very long time. In a game like Monster Hunter World, you can have all of these different loadouts equipped at the same time, including different items in your inventory, armor sets, the weaponry. You can swap between all of these for different monster fights. And that only makes sense because different monsters, just like the bosses in Elden Ring, have different resistances, weaknesses, and movesets that make certain loadouts more effective than others. In Elden Ring, some bosses are highly vulnerable to fire damage and others are completely immune to it. I just find it baffling that you can't quickly change your loadout in this game, even after all these years of iteration and feedback. Sure, you can swap out your weapons fairly quickly, but because so many of these weapons have certain skill checks, it's very possible on your first run of the game that you won't be able to use the weapon that's ideal for the fight at hand. And I know for a fact that a lot of people probably got stuck on some of the later game bosses in Elden Ring, and after 5 hours of banging their heads against the wall, they decided to deploy the nuclear option and completely rework their character into a form that's better optimized for the boss they were stuck at. I'm totally not speaking from experience here, not at all. I also checked with some of my college buddies who played this game and found out that a lot of them did this very thing as well. Players will go to the academy, they'll get reborn if they have the required items. If not, they'll need to go spend half an hour hunting one of those down after looking up where to find it online. And then they'll go into their inventory and try to rebuild their character in a way that is ideal for the boss fight they've just been stuck on. They probably then realize that they need to level up the weapon itself that they're going to use, so they need to then go hunt down the necessary objects, grab some more runes by heading to some high-level areas, killing some grunts in order to have enough runes to level up the weapons once you have the smithing stones required. And at the end of all of this, they have a loadout that is much better equipped for the boss that they're stuck at. It's true. They take on the boss, beat them after a few tries, and then wanting to go back to the build that they were using as their main build, they have to go all the way back through the beginning of the process, go back to the academy, respec again, re-equip all of their weaponry, armor, items, and then get back into it. It's a process that bloats what's already a frustrating time with the game, dealing with a boss you're stuck at, and bloats it out by an hour to an hour and a half of hunting down mining materials and smithing stones and runes to level up a weapon that you haven't used yet, and figuring out the move set so that you can use it better against this boss. It's just needlessly tedious. You know, it's okay to have a difficult game. We all love difficult games, that's why we're playing something like Elden Ring. But there's a difference between a difficult game and a game that's trying to be tedious and trying to be overly convoluted. And I don't think Elden Ring is trying to do that. I think they just are resting on the laurels of past games, such as the Dark Souls franchise, and they're doing things the same way they did in those games when they don't need to. In a game like Elden Ring, there are so many bosses and so many different ways to approach the bosses that it just seems like such a missed opportunity to not have hot swappable loadouts. It's baffling to me that they're not here. If I was going to add any system or any feature to Elden Ring, I would have added that. Like, before summons, before any of this other stuff, I would have added in quickly accessible and hot swappable loadouts, because I think it would have been so much better. And this is why I think it's important to criticize these companies and hold their feet to the fire. We can be fans of From Software as a team of developers, but that doesn't mean that they are perfect. I'm actually really glad to see that so many people have grown skeptical of the perfect descriptions we've heard surrounding Elden Ring in recent months. Because when the game launched, everybody was saying that it was the next Breath of the Wild, that it was basically perfect, that it would be talked about for decades to come, and it's one of the greatest games ever made. And I'm sure the reviewers truly felt that way at the time, but let's be real, Breath of the Wild had a lot of issues, as does Elden Ring. It's really good, but pretending as though the developers are infallible doesn't achieve anything at all. Like, literally nothing. There is no reason to hype this game up beyond just saying it's really, really, really good. Because if you suggest that it's in some separate category of masterpiece, then constructive criticism isn't heard, it's not considered, and these games in the future releases won't grow beyond this current scope, and it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help for players to make excuses for objectively bad design choices or for poor optimization. And secondly, it makes people feel crazy if they come across something that isn't well put together and they try to express it online or to their friends, only to be met with disdain and frustration. And most importantly, it prevents From Software from hearing and considering valuable constructive criticism. The only way that future games from these studios get better is if we criticize them when they have problems and we praise them for the good attributes and features that are contained therein. Level heads prevail, and we need to remember that. Now let's talk about the narrative for a few minutes. Now, it will come as no surprise to most of you that I've been very skeptical of From Software's narrative approach for the last few years. I personally don't really enjoy the vague storytelling put forward here. The reason I don't really care is that I don't really consider these narrative games. I don't play Dark Souls 3 for the story, I play for the atmosphere, interesting level design, and the combat. And I think that's probably true of most players. There's certainly a very devoted group of fans who pride themselves on carefully studying the game's lore and the extremely limited dialogue, and for those people there seems to be enough to keep them really motivated and captivated. And for those people there seems to be enough here to keep them captivated, but I'm just not one of them. So instead of pretending that I understand the story at the heart of Elden Ring, I'm just going to come clean and say that I don't really know what's going on here. Of course, I get the broad strokes. You are maidenless, tarnished, and yet you have immense power and seem to be capable of taking on some of the most powerful beings in all of the realm. The Elden Ring was a magical ring created by the Great Will, but it was destroyed by Queen Marika in an attempt to resurrect Godwyn, blah 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 blah. But to be completely honest, it's not really the focus of this video to go through that story carefully. Other YouTubers have done a far better job of breaking down the main game story, so I won't even pretend as though I'm capable of giving it the same treatment. Instead, I just want to quickly appreciate how all of these bosses share core themes, have relationships with each other, and maintain the same general tone. I've tried to put into words while writing this script exactly what I mean by this, and I've honestly just really struggled to define what I mean here. All I can say is that you know it when you see it. All of Bloodborne's bosses, for example, fit into the same general vibe. They're all distinct, they look and sound different, but you see them and you know that they fit into Bloodborne. You know where these things live and what universe they're contained within. In the same way that here in Elden Ring, all of the bosses feel really distinct and at home within this game. At first I thought it had something to do with the color palettes that they're using for the character design, or maybe the sound design, or the sets or arenas, but all of this is so varied throughout the game that I don't think any one of these could be the culprit for why these bosses feel so congruent. But all I know is that they do, and it really helps you become immersed in this world as you're hunting each of these bosses down one by one. It's really, really impressive, and I think it's not appreciated enough in these games. Not only do the animators have to be working well with the character designers and with the level designers, but also the music has to tie and be coherent within all of it. I think if anything, it's a real testament to the incredible directorial skills of Hidetaka Miyazaki, because he's the one that has to oversee all of this and make sure it works together. That's his job as the director of the studio, and he's incredible at it. Like, you can't praise it enough. It's so impressive to me. But what I don't know is just what the hell George R.R. Martin did in this game. Like, I have no idea. In the advertising and trailers, he was front and center. His name was all over the trailers that you see leading up to the game's launch. And it's clear that Bandai Namco were really trying to imply that he had a major role in developing the narrative of the game. But once we got our hands on it on launch day, it became very clear that the story of Elden Ring wasn't going to be significantly different in terms of communicative approach or style to Dark Souls or any other From Software game. It was going to be more of the same. We've come to find over the last few months that George mostly helped in the early stages of the game's development, having had a few discussions with Hidetaka Miyazaki where they came up with the game's themes and the broad storyline. But after that, the team over at From Software filled in most of the gaps with assistance from some people around George R.R. Martin. Honestly, there's just nothing here that feels even remotely attributable directly to George R.R. Martin. Like, it all just seems as though it could have come from Hidetaka Miyazaki, and I don't know what George R.R. Martin was doing. Like, I think he probably helped with the general themes of like, oh, well, maybe there's these, like a ring, and then people pound it with a hammer, and then there's a lady with only one arm, and he's got ideas like that, but I don't think he was involved in, like, what does this boss look like? What's his name? What's his story and relationship with the other characters? What should his moveset be like? I'm not convinced he had that much say. I don't know, maybe I'm just butthurt because I expected more, but the advertising agencies and the marketing people involved definitely knew what they were doing. They were putting George's name all over the game's trailers to imply that he was going to have a very large role in the development of the game's narrative, which implied to many people, including myself, that Elden Ring was going to have a much greater focus on the narrative compared to previous games, because why else would they bring in the guy from Game of Thrones? But none of it seemed to be true at all. I even looked up articles from before the game launched, and I remembered reading some of them. And in these articles, they describe how multiple members of George's staff worked on the game with From Software. They even described a time when some of the members of George's direct staff took time off of filming the final season of Game of Thrones to help with the early conceptualization of Elden Ring. But again, maybe I'm just the one with unrealistic expectations. I don't know what the hell they were doing or what they contributed here. Maybe they were writing dialogue for the trees or something. I don't know. Maybe they came up with the finger theme or something, but like, seriously, I don't know what they spent all that time doing. I just don't get it. I won't continue to drag this down. I'm just a little bummed out. I was hoping for more. Maybe this would be the first time we could see a From Software game with carefully written dialogue so that the story isn't communicated so vaguely, but no, it's just not in the cards, I guess. But setting all of that aside for the time being, I think it's important to note just how cohesive and coherent the themes are within all of the characters and the world itself. This is one of those things that you notice when it isn't working properly, and you don't even think of it when it is working correctly, you know, that type of thing. But setting all of that aside, I want to move on, and I want to discuss the Elden Ring experience writ large. The first thing is the reviews, because this is what framed most of our impressions of the game. Most players hopped on to Elden Ring after hearing that it was getting near perfect scores across the board, and so many of us started the game up with very, very high expectations. But this is where I want to communicate something that I've touched on in previous videos. I've mentioned it on stream a ton, so if you've heard me do this rant before, I'm sorry, but I think it's important to outline here. I've received game review codes before. I know how the sausage is made. I've been involved in that process. What you need to understand about reviews from big publications and big review sites such as IGN or GameSpot is that when they're deciding editorially who is going to review a given game, they aren't just throwing the code out willy-nilly. They are selecting the reviewer for that game based on their previous experience, what other games they've reviewed, and what games they know, play, and are passionate about. So if you are looking at getting a code for Elden Ring and you're like, well, we need somebody to do the official review for this, who are we going to have do it? They're going to give it to the guy who's played every From Software game from the last 20 years and loves these games and is very passionate about them. They're going to give him the code and let him work on the review until it's done and decide what score this game deserves. They're not going to give it to the guy that's obsessed with Mario Kart and only plays Sims. And this makes sense. I'm not bashing them for this. Like, if I were deciding who was going to review a game for a website I was running, yes, I would choose it in the same way. It only makes sense. But why that's important to understand is because if you are an outside player who hasn't played From Software games before, for example, and you're looking at the reviews for something like Elden Ring and you see it's getting 10s, that's a 10 from the perspective of somebody who loves these types of games and knows how they work and understands what works and what doesn't. That's not a 10 from the average gamer's perspective or the casual gamer's perspective. That's a 10 from the From Software fans' perspective. And I think part of the issue was that a lot of players looked at it in the former light, not the latter light. I had a buddy of mine who wasn't a diehard fan of From Software games before Elden Ring, saw the great reviews and said, well, I mean, it's getting perfect scores, so I should try it. I'll give it a shot. And he booted it up, had a horrible time, and hated it. So he shut the game down and felt lied to. He was like, I can't believe I bought this. People said this was a 10. It was just more of the same. I can't believe it. But that's exactly the point. It was a 10 for a From Software fan, not a 10 for Joe Schmo, average gamer, person who plays Call of Duty casually or any of the other, like Rocket League or anything like that. If you like those games, that's great. There's no problem, but just understand that these reviews were written from the From Software fans' perspective. And there's not much more to say about that other than to just bear that in mind moving forward as you see reviews for other games or other releases, you know, in the coming years. Just remember who they probably assigned to review it. You know, we always laugh when they give like Call of Duty an 8 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10 every year when the game is just more of the same from last year and the value proposition's terrible. Same with like Madden or FIFA reviews. But it's because they're having Madden fans review Madden. They're having FIFA fans review FIFA. So it's reviewed from that perspective. Just don't get it twisted. I'm not saying that there's a problem with that. I don't know how else you would possibly review games. But it's important to remember that because when you are looking at reviews for games, you gotta find a reviewer or a critic who you generally agree with, you like their logic or their way of thinking, you like similar games as they do, and then follow their recommendations because that's gonna be the way that you have the most reliable information to make your purchasing decisions. Don't just go from Joe Schmo who's a fan of this type of game and then, big surprise, happen to like the game that was made by a company that he really enjoys. Instead, find somebody you like and generally agree with and then trust their opinion and inform it however else you can. But I touched on that friend of mine who had a terrible time with the game. Let's talk about fun factor. It's no mystery that one of the best parts, if not the best part of From Software games, are the bosses. And the quality of these really generally determines the quality of the overall experience you'll have with the game. And Elden Ring has a lot of them. Over 100 bosses that are all unique, very interesting, have their own movesets and qualities, elemental damage, weaknesses, you name it, it's all here. It's great. Some of the more notable bosses would be Margit, I think it's Margit. I'm gonna say Margit. The Red Wolf, Renala, the Fire Giant, Malekith, Radon, God-Devouring Serpent, Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, and another fight that I found was particularly interesting, Commander Njal. I'm sorry, whenever I read his name, I think of that American Dad thing of Roger, you know, the meow. It's just stupid. Oh, shut up now, don't worry. Now, Margit and Godric serve as great introductory bosses to the game. They're some of the first major bosses players will take on, and they have varied movesets, they deal out a lot of damage, but they serve as great introductions to some of the later bosses, which are going to take their generalized movesets and crank it up a notch. The Red Wolf was interesting to me because I actually bailed out of this encounter the first time I met him, only to come back later when I had leveled up and I had a much easier time with him. We talked about DPS checks earlier. This is one of them. Everybody's going to have to be funneled through the Red Wolf, and he deals out a lot of damage. So if you don't have a character properly leveled at this point in the game, you're just going to get pimp slapped and one-shotted if you're not careful, at which point you'll leave, level up, and then come back, and he's relatively easy to take on once you can eat a couple of those big hits. I love his movement. He's very Bloodborne-esque, but yet strangely regal as he carries the sword. It just is really interesting as a fight to me. Unfortunately, the arena itself is really crammed, and with multiple levels of height, it doesn't really work well with some of the more hectic attacks he has, such as this one where he leaps up high into the air and slams down. To get around this, you have to dodge pretty quickly, and the differently raised platforms don't cooperate with these rolls. I got caught on them multiple times, which slowed me down just enough to eat one of these attacks, and it was always frustrating because usually that was enough to either kill me in one shot or almost kill me. Again, you gotta remember these games are really only satisfying and fun when the damage dealt out feels fair, and when you glitch into a step because it's raised in this arena, it doesn't feel fair. Renala is nearby, and I really like her for the look, but she's a really lame gimmick fight, at least through the first phase. You basically run around, find the person that's casting the magic spell that's keeping her levitated, and after you take out 3 of them, running around the edges of the arena, she falls down, you deal some damage, and then she floats back up. You find the next 3 that are holding her up with the magic, and the process repeats. The second phase is really interesting to me because you go into this weird arena with a big moon in the background on a giant lake, it appears. It reminds me a lot of Rom the Vacuous Spider from Bloodborne, and I really like it. She has some big magic attacks which will one-shot you in this arena, but if you're using any summons, they'll tend to eat most of the hits for you, and if you're not using summons, you can generally dodge through these relatively easily. Multi-phased fights are really hit or miss in this franchise, and especially in Elden Ring, but in this case, the first phase is easy enough that it's not that big of a deal. You'll be able to get through it very reliably almost every single time, which means that getting to the second phase isn't that big of a deal. As for the Fire Giant, I really don't like this boss. The camera is just really clunky, and I've always thought that these fights against really huge bosses in these games are just not very well done. They also always have one very small or very convenient weakness that you can take advantage of really easily. In this case, it's a brace on his ankle. You take it out, he falls down, you deal more damage, and then in his second phase, you just run around to his back and slap his butt. It's just kind of stupid as far as I'm concerned. And the camera control is still a very big problem. They just don't know how to set the camera properly for these huge bosses, and inevitably it glitches out, clips into things it's not supposed to clip into. You have trouble seeing where you're going, and it just doesn't work very well. The Fire Giant could have been really, really cool, but instead I just found him more frustrating than he was worth. Though I will admit he does look really cool, and thematically it's a really awesome boss fight. Malekith, though, is probably my favorite boss in the entire game. After much consideration, that is. I went back and forth between this guy and Rykard, who we'll go to next, but I really like this guy. He's just very smooth, he feels fair, it's oddly beautiful, the music is tremendous. I love this boss fight. I have almost nothing but positive things to say. The arena is good, The art design in the arena is awesome. I just love it. As I just mentioned, one of the other bosses I found compelling was the God-devouring Serpent and Rykard, the Lord of Blasphemy. Both of these are great fights. They are beautiful and the music is tremendous, and the cutscenes between phases are some of the best that I've seen in this game, full stop. One thing I do feel is important to note is that I really don't like AoE attacks that feel unfair and are almost impossible to dodge. Like, for real, look at this one. How the hell am I supposed to respond to this attack? What the hell is going on? This fight also uses a tool called the Serpent Hunter, which is a weapon that's found within the arena itself. It's a spear that the God-devouring Serpent, or the first phase of this fight, is extremely weak to. And it also has extremely long range, thanks to its L2 ability that shoots out a pillar of wind that deals massive damage. Everyone who played Dark Souls 3 will immediately think of the fight against Yorm the Giant with the Storm Ruler sword that you also found in the arena. But in the case of Yorm the Giant, with Storm Ruler, that fight was just a total joke if you use the weapon they give you. Whereas in this one, I would say the Serpent Hunter is probably necessary for the fight, though it doesn't ever feel as though it's just an instant cheese. It just allows you to actually deal damage because there is a pool of lava surrounding the boss, and if you aren't using something with a lot of range, you won't be able to get close enough to deal damage to get past this first phase. So it really seems as though they intend for you to use the Serpent Hunter whether you like it or not. And depending on how difficult you find the fight, once you start using the Serpent Hunter, you can level it up to +10, which makes the fight even easier. I really like the artistic direction of this fight, but I do think it's pretty clunky and needs a lot more polish. Radon is another fight that's really cool, especially artistically and visually, but it's extremely inconsistent in terms of gameplay. It really doesn't feel fair most of the time, but once again, this could just be because this fight in particular has struggled the most with inconsistent balancing. Every time From Software puts out a patch, they either break this fight by making it way too difficult or breaking it by making it far too easy. Maybe by the time you're watching this video, they've struck a good balance, but as of right now, months after the game's launch, the Radon fight is currently in a state where it feels easier than it should be, which is too bad because when it strikes that good balance where it's tough, not too easy, not too hard, but tough and satisfying, it's very, very cool. And like I said, I find the Commander Nyal fight, again, just Roger, I find this fight really interesting. He's just a really solid, tough fight. He doesn't feel unfair. He's very robust, has a predictable and yet varied moveset, and I just really like it. I don't have much else to say other than it's a tough fight, but it's very satisfying to get through. It feels like an old school Dark Souls fight, and I mean that in the best way possible. It's really good. And it's tucked away in a corner of the snowy region of the map, so a lot of players probably didn't even get here, but behind him is hidden some really nice armor that's really useful against other brute enemies that deal a lot of blunt damage. So it's definitely worth taking on if you're going to go into New Game Plus, that is. But some of the bosses that totally flop, unfortunately, I would say are the dragon bosses. I just really don't like these. You have to sprint around on Torrent to fight with ranged attacks, and you swing around trying to whack at their legs. It's just not very compelling, and it feels really stupid if I'm being real. And don't even get me started on trying to take on one of these dragons if you happen to be using a great sword or any weapon that doesn't move really, really quickly or have extreme range. These fights are miserable. The one major exception to the dragon rule would be the Lich Dragon Fortisax, which has to be one of the greatest names of any boss in any game ever. This fight is as beautiful as it is chaotic. I wouldn't call it the most difficult fight in the game, but it does feel as fair as a dragon fight can feel in any of these games. You know, it has a similar style of design to Dark Eater Midir from the Dark Souls 3 DLC, The Ring City, where in general, the dragon sits pretty still, doesn't move around a whole lot, has some AoE and ranged attacks, but you can get up in its snout and deal some damage. I think it's a good way of doing these fights, and I much prefer it to the dragon fights out in the open world of Elden Ring, where they fly around and it just is more tedious than anything to plink away at them trying to deal damage as they fly overhead. And this is the cool thing, like I was working on this script trying to figure out what we should talk about, what bosses we should discuss and why. And I was gonna just like blast through all of them and offer my thoughts on everything. But then I realized, like, in general, most of the comments are the same. It's like, it's really good. The animations feel fair, the lore is interesting, the set piece is beautiful, the animations are smooth. Like, I would basically just spend an hour going through every boss and being like, I really like it, it's really cool, I love it. And that's just not that interesting. So instead, I'm just going to highlight these and say, I've got some interesting and unique thoughts on these, but in general, the bosses in this game are tremendous. But I do need to award the funniest boss fight of the game award, which is not one I expected to divvy out, but I felt like I needed to mention it. Basically, if you want to acquire the Mimic tier, which allows you to basically summon a version of yourself, it's a direct carbon copy of your loadout, your character stats, everything, but it fights alongside you as a summon. It's really broken. It's more balanced now, but at launch it was totally broken. If you want to do that, you have to fight a mimic of yourself, one-on-one. It's this little arena you find in an alternative area of the map, and it's fascinating because that fight, it copies what you're wearing and what you have equipped when you cross a certain threshold. So if you know where that's going to come, or if you've tried the fight before and you've died, what you can do is, as you approach, you just take off all of your clothes and unequip your armor and your weapons and everything, walk past the threshold, and then right as the mimic is spawning in, you reapply all of that stuff to you, and then you're back fully decked out, wearing armor and using weapons and things, but the mimic will have been summoned and copied off of the naked version of yourself. So you'll just be fighting a naked humanoid that's trying to slap you, and it's really, really funny. It totally breaks the boss. Like, it is the most cheese way of dealing with this possible, but I found it really, really funny. That's it. The funniest fight award, the Mimic tier mini boss fight. I love it. It was so funny when I figured out you could do that. And then I looked it up, and a lot of people had already figured it out, so I wasn't as smart as I thought I was. But I thought it was really, really funny that you can do that and just fight a naked version of yourself. It's just funny. But let's touch on the lasting legacy of Elden Ring. No matter which way you look at it, this game is pretty fantastic. It does a lot very, very well, but certainly could have benefited from a little more polish and refinement and some added features such as the hot swappable loadouts that I keep going on and on about. As I've said a few times, I think in many ways From Software here created a monster that they eventually lost control of. Early in development, they had a pretty clear vision of what this game was going to be, I'm sure, and that's basically Dark Souls in an open world with a mount that you can ride around to traverse quicker, and that's an awesome idea, and it ended up being a great game. It really makes sense that they would imagine that game and want to make it, but certain systems that they built in Dark Souls 3, Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 1, Bloodborne, Sekiro don't scale that well, and they need a lot more attention to make sure that you can retain the Dark Souls experience while avoiding the growing pains of expanding into an open world. Without a doubt, there are very few studios which would be able to pull off a game of this scale and magnitude while avoiding the aforementioned growing pains. It certainly takes a lot of work and effort, but even then, the solutions for one game won't necessarily apply to another. For example, Skyrim manages all of this scaling by having certain weapons locked behind hard skill checks. They have large DPS checks that gate players out of certain areas, certain locations are locked behind quest activities, and perhaps the cherry on top of all of this is that they didn't take it very seriously and the combat didn't demand very much precision in terms of balance. In the case of something like The Witcher 3, all of the enemies had levels assigned to them, which scaled their damage output and HP capacities. If you were of a similar level or higher, you could take on that area pretty confidently as long as you had weaponry at about the same level as your own. But all of these solutions, when put together, don't necessarily apply well to a game like Elden Ring, which is trying to do something very different. I don't think it would work to have every NPC and boss given a firm level suggestion that sits next to their health bars. The combat is also, in Elden Ring, supposed to be much more grueling and difficult, which is why Skyrim's approach wouldn't apply, because that game wasn't trying to offer that combat experience. It just goes to show you that what works well for one great game doesn't necessarily work well for another great game. Individual solutions need to be applied. After a lot of very careful consideration, I've actually come to the conclusion that you either need a very strict leveling system to maintain the difficulty across all encounters consistently, like your typical level scaling that you'll see in a lot of RPGs, or you let it just work itself out, which is the route that From Software took in this game. Instead of making sure every encounter was consistently difficult, they just allowed the player to explore the map freely and to stumble onto some of the most difficult bosses and some of the easiest bosses all at the same time. Sure, it has the negative effect of having very inconsistent difficulty for players, but it also has the positive effect of taking everybody's experience with the game and making it unique. As we discussed earlier, it also enables the player to balance the game for themselves by leveling up separately and only taking on encounters when they personally feel ready for them. It's definitely the lazier of the two options, and it's easier for the development team to just let go and let players regulate it themselves, and it can certainly result in a lot of players growing frustrated or bored, but judging by Elden Ring's overwhelming success, it seems as though players don't really mind. I've previously bashed developers, as I mentioned earlier, for doing this same thing. I remember even criticizing games like The Witcher 3 or Assassin's Creed Origins or Odyssey and Valhalla for relying on players rebalancing the games for themselves. Because basically in those games, if you ran into an encounter that was too difficult, you could just pop into the options menu and lower the difficulty for that encounter, only to raise it back up once you're done. But the difference is in those examples, the player was going into the menus to alter the level scaling. Whereas in the case of Elden Ring, you are going out and playing the game further to rebalance it. Whether that's fighting other bosses for runes or just grinding in some lucrative locations, you're still playing the game to alter the difficulty of an encounter that you struggled with before. And that to me seems like a much better solution to inconsistent difficulty than just giving players a magic wand that can raise or lower enemy health bars in the form of a difficulty slider. So while I don't think it's a perfect solution, I think it's a fair one for the time being. I would still insist that they should get rid of the grinding locations that have been so publicized on platforms like TikTok, because I would say that grinding one small location for runes only to quickly reload and repeat for hours on end results in a much worse experience for the player at the end of the day than if you just balance the game properly such that they don't have to do that, or such that they could get those same rune payoffs by engaging in some of the more fun elements of the game, such as the large boss fights. They'll have to do some light tweaking, such as removing some sites of grace to make the grinding so inconvenient that it's not practical, or greatly increasing the difficulty of certain areas that are commonly used for farming, but I think you would also need to give players an alternative if you're going to task them with balancing the game for themselves. This would probably be in the form of some items that you can pop that give you a marker for the closest boss encounter, for example. I think this could be really fun, not just for the players that are struggling in certain areas because they aren't high level enough, but it would also be fun for people who are just looking to speedrun the game for boss fights without having to have the wiki pulled up on their laptop next to them. You could just explore the lands between, pop an item that leads you to the closest boss fight you haven't completed, and take it on. I, for one, know that I would use this all the time. It would almost be like the Sheikah slate in Breath of the Wild that allows you to track where the closest shrines are. But instead of shrines, it would lead you to boss encounters. I think it would be a great addition, and I would love to use it. And I know some of you are thinking, well, they should probably just add a boss rush mode, and I think that actually could be a really cool addition, especially in something like a DLC. Like for real, From Software, just give us the ability, perhaps after we've completed the game once, to load directly into a boss arena or encounter with a given loadout that we've selected. It could even be something like the Chalice dungeons in Bloodborne, where you can fight the bosses in one large arena to your heart's content. I think this would add so much to the game's longevity, and it would definitely be helpful for new players who just want to drill some particularly difficult bosses until they get them sorted out. I can only imagine how useful it would be for speedrunners who want to practice no-hit runs without having to use outside software to quick load into certain areas, but I'll leave it there. Because I know a lot of other people want this from the developers and have been asking for a boss rush mode for years. I really don't know why they don't just do it at this point. It seems like such a no-brainer. I really don't know if it's for some artistic reason, or if it's just laziness, or if there's some other limitation, maybe with the engine that I haven't considered, but it seems like this would be an easy way to win some massive brownie points from fans. Even if it's a DLC for $10, I would buy it. Like for 10 bucks, I can do a quick run to any boss in the game I want and just blast through those. I mean, yeah, it would be better if it were free, but I mean, come on. I just want a boss rush mode, that's all. That's what I want. But going back to the legacy of Elden Ring, I find this whole discussion really compelling because while I think the game is not a masterpiece and has a lot of issues itself, I do think it is tremendous. I don't think it's a triumph of open world design, but I do think it does a good job with its open world design. I really think what this comes down to is the hype was primarily generated because fans of From Software games are die-hard fans. They love these games with a passion, and I get why. They're great games. I would even say I'm a big fan, probably not die-hard, but a big fan of these games. But that being said, I can still point out things and recognize things that I don't think are working well, or things that I think would greatly improve the experience. But those diehard fans, they are so used to blasting through Dark Souls for the 15th time that when they saw that they were going to get effectively 100 bosses, a game 10 times the size of something like Dark Souls 3, and they could just explore freely, find whatever bosses they want, stumble onto them while navigating the world to their heart's content. That was a dream come true, something people have been asking for a long time. And so it seemed like a dream come true, which is why there was a fair amount of hyperbole. If I put it this way, I just don't know what singular thing you could point to in Elden Ring that is so unbelievably unique that it's revolutionary or a totally new idea that nobody's thought of. Basically what they did is they took really high quality boss encounters and then sprinkled them through a pretty competently designed open world and gave the player the freedom to explore it in whichever order or way they wanted to, with a robust combat system backing it up. It's not particularly revolutionary, but they just did something that nobody else has done anywhere near as well. I mean, I could point to The Witcher 3, which had a big open world that was very well designed, and they tried to sprinkle it with mini bosses and side quests. You could stumble into monster nests while out in a forest. It was a very well put together open world, but the combat system wasn't as robust as Elden Ring's, and the bosses definitely were not the centerpiece. So it was good, but it didn't feel great. And Skyrim did the same thing, but again, the combat system wasn't tremendous, so it's like still a very good game, but it's not great in terms of its combat and those boss encounters. But then Elden Ring comes along and does all of that with amazing boss encounters and with a very robust combat system, and it feels tremendous, and it feels remarkable and unique and different. Because it is. Other parts of the game I do insist are lacking. This is far from a perfect game, but I think in the pursuit of what they were trying to achieve, and that is to give us Dark Souls in an open world, they succeeded fantastically, and they deserve all the praise they've received. I know a lot of people have bashed some of the additions, such as the summons that they introduced, or a lot of the OP weapons that are here, but all told, I think these are great additions, and I think the game works very coherently and cohesively. Everything just works. The lasting impression I have, the lasting legacy of Elden Ring for me, is that it's a remarkable game, and one that I wish I could experience again for the first time, because that moment of realization of all of the opportunities and possibilities, of the countless bosses and all the mysteries that might be out there as I look across the vast expanse, that's a feeling you don't get very often in a video game. It's a special feeling. It's one that I think separates great games from good games. You know, when you wish you could erase your memory to experience it again for the first time. I felt that for Breath of the Wild, for The Witcher 3, Red Dead Redemption 2, and I feel that for Elden Ring as well. But let me know what you think of Elden Ring in the comment section below the like button. I'm really interested in hearing all of your thoughts. Thank you to everybody who pitched in to help produce this over on Patreon, or donations and subs over on Twitch. I really appreciate that. And to everybody who's been sending tips through YouTube, which is a new thing apparently. That's incredibly generous. If you didn't know, you can actually tip through the YouTube page on a video you particularly appreciate, and the money goes straight to us to continue producing these videos, and you also get a little notifier. You can leave a comment that's highlighted with your donation, so you get to stand out in the comment section. It's really cool. So for all of you who have done that, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you, truly. But with that, I'm going to leave it right there. Thank you all for watching. I love you more than you could possibly know, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.
Znajdź swój pomysł na lato z Lidl.pl i wybierz to, czego potrzebujesz. Online. Super okazje do domu, warsztatu czy na letni wypad czekają. W tym akcesoria sportowe, odzież, sprzęt AGD, narzędzia do ogrodu i warsztatu. Sprawdź więcej i zamawiaj z dostawą do domu na Lidl.pl.
Assassin's Creed Valhalla is probably one of the weirdest and most bizarre games that I've ever played. In many ways, it's really good, with a beautiful. So as a game critic, I get asked all the time, Luke, baby girl, what's your favorite game of all time? And it's a fair question. You know, usually I throw out your obligatory answers like The Witcher 3, Red Dead Redemption 2, The Last of Us, all of those types of answers. But the one game which is truly special and that I hold near and dear to my heart betwixt my bosom is Batman Arkham City. Fun fact, this is actually the very first game I ever got 100% completion on. I played the ever-living crap out of this back in the day, and it really ignited my love for open world games and for darker, grittier narrative titles as well. In many ways, I think this game is to thank in a lot of ways for this channel even existing, because this is kind of what started my love for these types of games. And it certainly inspired a lot of games that came in the years after it released. So I thought, what better way of evaluating whether or not it holds up to the test of time than to go back and actually play through some of it again here live so that you can see what I see. And we're gonna get into it. Make sure to hit the like button if you enjoy the videos, sub for new videos like this and a bunch of big critiques, all that blah, blah, blah. Follow my social media. You've heard it before, you know what to do. Moving on. Now this is where the game opens up with us fighting a bunch of brutes as Catwoman, and right away we're introduced to an updated version of the free flow combat system that everybody loved so much in the first game. It's more refined, and in addition we can play as Catwoman now, which is awesome, but this has its own caveats, but we'll get to that in just a little bit when we talk about some of the stuff this game does that is not worthy of praise, because I know we can look back at this and like look at it very fondly and like, oh yeah, it's so great and I love it so dearly. But part of the reason I do these videos where we go back and try these games again is because sometimes we see things that, let's just say, haven't aged well, or things that our rose-tinted glasses don't allow us to see, or that we just choose to overlook. And in the case of Batman Arkham City, there are a fair number of these things. One thing that's aged really well are the physics. So this ran in Unreal Engine, which is why it has that very unique look to it that is kind of hard to describe, but you know it when you see it. But it also implements these NVIDIA proprietary physics engine systems, which to this day, I mean, this is pretty cool. You can just walk and like kick around the rug while you're fighting. I mean, that's pretty damn cool. Like, come on, that's pretty awesome. What other game does that even now? Like, that's not really a thing. You know, in a lot of ways, I think it's a testament to how well this game was built back in 2011 when it launched. It was built so well that it's doing stuff that even now in 2022, over a decade later, we look at and are like, wow, that's actually pretty good. That's impressive. Graphically, I don't think this game looks bad either. I mean, you can obviously tell the models that they're using are lower poly, so I mean, this game ran on the 360. Give them a break. But in general, it still looks pretty damn good. And here we get introduced to Dr. Strange, Dr. Hugo.
Thank you.
Strange.
Capturing Bruce Wayne is so much easier
Ooh.
than Batman.
And also, look at the reflection in his glasses. You can actually see the reflection of Bruce Wayne in his glasses. That's something that we didn't see for like 5, 6, 7 years until they introduced ray tracing. And I don't know why it was so bizarrely difficult to pull off if they were able to do it relatively well here. Maybe they like baked in the effect to the glasses, I don't know, but either way it looks tremendous. And I mean, you barely see that nowadays even. Come on. But like, look at this, there's even a mirror that we can see here that looks pretty good and directly reflects what we're seeing in our world here. And apparently the way they used to do this was basically with a camera in the position like back within the scene, looking back at the player character, and then they project what that camera sees onto this wall, so it looks like a mirror, but it's actually just sort of like a display of the rendered game within the game. So it's not like what they're doing with ray tracing, but still I think it looks pretty good, and it accomplishes the intended goal, so who cares, right? Hey, don't knock over chairs, you prick. Bam. Much love. I'm gonna sneak a little SIM card. Or that's more of like an SD card, but whatever. Ooh, thanks a lot. Let's go. Okay. Love it. Will Smith is in this game? No wonder it slaps. Okay, if you want to click off the video, I totally get it. I understand. You know, it's been nice. It's been fun. I appreciate you. You know, this whole YouTube thing was a fun experiment, but I get it. I get it. And there is the penguin. Okay, the penguin's character design in this is just tremendous. Like, so iconic. It's unique, but still true to the comics, and it's just so great. And that's one thing across the board in this game. Every little character design, every piece of artwork that they did is fantastically well realized, and it's so impressive to me.
What's up? Do you need me to call you butler?
Cobblepot.
Oh, you remember me?
And look at the bottle butt is the actual monocle.
Destroyed my
Like, I don't know why he has that. The guy's got money. He could afford a nice monocle, but whatever. I mean, maybe there is a narrative reason for that. If there is, you should let me know in the comments, because I don't remember if that's explained, but either way, I mean, it's memorable. You'll also notice here during our first introduction to, I would say major introduction to the Batman version of the combat system, I don't have hit markers or attack notifiers over the enemy's heads when they're coming in to punch. That's because I am booting this up on New Game Plus, which of course you unlock after you've completed the main game. And it's harder, but you get all of the tools from the outset. And they also turn off those attack notifiers, which I personally cannot stand. And I've said for many, many years at this point, because I'm an old geezer, if you're going to play these games, you should play them on the hardest difficulty and without those attack like notifiers, because it forces you to kind of get into the mindset of Batman, and then to also just get a feeling for the rhythm of combat. And you'll get a lot better a lot quicker, I'm telling you what. Also, sidebar, does this actually do anything based on whether or not I attack the penguin? So like here, he's just posed up there, you can hit him and then he passes out. I don't know if that's referenced later, like when we see him again, if he goes, "Why'd you punch me?" You know, something like that. I don't know if there's an actual reference to it, because you don't have to punch him there. You can just leave him there cowering and it's not a big deal. But it would be cool if there's a reference later based on whether or not you punch him, you know? Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. If you know, let me know. While we climb the tower, I will also just quickly discuss and touch on the technical performance of the game, because it's not as good as I remember. So by default, the game is locked on PC at least at 60 frames. It's like, I think the limit is 22 frames and then the peak is 62 based on the INI files. There's a bunch of stuff in there that limits the frame rate. So I'm playing this 11 years after its launch, and I couldn't get this running above like 58 frames. And I was like, what the hell is wrong with me? Screen tearing all over the place. It was awful. It was terrible. I've actually already filmed this video once before. Took me like 3 hours, and then me and my editing team looked at it and we were like, there's so much screen tearing, we can't use this, it's unusable. So I'm here refilming the whole thing for you because I'm a perfectionist. But the point is, you can fix that. You basically have to go into the INI files and change them around so that you remove the low floor limit, and then you increase the ceiling to whatever your monitor's refresh rate is. And it works fine, but it sucks that that isn't natively supported or already done in the Steam version of the game. Like, it would be pretty easy for Rocksteady to go in there and tweak that on their end so that when you install the game, it just has the adjusted INI file, but for some reason they haven't, and it's unfortunate. So if you want to play this on Steam, know that you're gonna have to do that if you want it to run well. I also remember right here, so the barrel drops, boom, I'm gonna go up there and I'm gonna get my suit, right? Back in the day on the 360, if you were playing this, there was like a 20% chance that when I press A here, the game would freeze and there was no fix. Straight up. No fix. Like it happened to me on me and my brother's Xbox 360 that we shared. And I got to this point, I hit A, he puts the hand screen, and then the camera chain just right here, right there, boom. It would freeze right there, and you could not progress any further. It was just broken. And everybody seems to have just forgotten it. But I remember being livid that I couldn't play the game until we got like another copy, or I don't even remember how we fixed it. We like reinstalled or factory reset the Xbox 360 or something like that. It was stupid difficult to get over it. It was insane. But I mean, again, that's one thing people don't really remember when they look back at these games. They remember all the good parts and sort of ignore the bad parts, even though these games were far from perfect, let's be honest.
Confirmation that prisoner 4011
And here the camera pans down and we can see the city for the first time in a little more detail. See everybody heading into the courthouse because he's captured Catwoman. So boom, we got to get over there. And you know what we're going to do to get over there? We're going to glide. The first time we're able to glide. And it's awesome. Because in Batman Arkham Asylum, you had some gliding available to you, but the map was very, very small and you couldn't really travel freely. But in this game, you have basically a city to explore. So like, it's way more open. And look at this, like you can just glide, boom. And then I can dive, pick up some speed, and I can loop right back up, boom. There's also the Grapple Booster, whatever they call it. Basically, it allows you to grapple up places and then double tap A and it shoots you up high, which is a great addition after the first game. Like seriously, it would be so much worse and so much more stiff if you couldn't use that. I love it dearly. And unfortunately, it's something you don't unlock until a bit later in the game. So navigation before you unlock that is gonna feel a little stilted, but once you get it, it feels great. Again, the only reason I have it now is because I am playing on New Game Plus where they let you keep all of those abilities, which is a nice way to do it, I think. Oh, these finishers, man. I remember like my elbow actually hurting watching some of these guys get their elbows twisted around. Oh, it's so crunchy. I love it. But you see what I mean? Like you just kind of get a feel for the attacks when they're coming. So you don't need the notifier. You see them start to like flinch like they're coming for you, and then you just tap Y and you're good. And I think that's the only way to keep this combat system really fresh. Otherwise it does start to get a little stale, because the more you play these games, the more you'll get used to just the rhythm of it, and it starts to feel a bit button mashy, where you're just running around like slamming X based on like the particular timing that you see. And you don't need to do that. Like you can play it on hard and with these attack notifiers turned off, and it still feels fresh even after you've played this game 500 times. This is one thing I also remember. The level design was tremendous. Like we're in the courthouse. This is Two-Face's, or Harvey Dent's courthouse where he hangs out in Arkham City, and you see half of it is all torn up and burnt and falling apart, and the other half is very put together, very regal. And it's a perfect dichotomy. It's a perfect contrast between the two states of mind that he's struggling with. And it's just a fantastic touch. It works great. I love it. That, you know, it's that little attention to detail that really makes a difference. You also see all these papers fluttering around the floor. As I walk, I can kick them around. Again, those little touches make this game stand out as one of the most obsessively put together pieces of art in recent memory. And this is why the game still stands today and is so remarkable even to this day. It's because all that attention to detail makes this game stand out against the competition, not just from 2011, but from every year since then, because very few studios put this much time, care, and effort into it, which is all the more impressive when we talk about a couple of the things that we'll mention here in just a few minutes. But you know what? The real star of the show in this game is the Joker. So I want to jump to the Joker and see what he's got to say. But of course, there's no Joker without Harley Quinn. And guess who we get to meet next? Not Harley Quinn. No, Harley Quinn. This is so great. She comes running. She just bum rushes you, and then you just counter, flip her around. It's great. I remember that to this day, being like, oh crap, a boss fight with Harley Quinn. Then you just throw her to the side. It's over. I find it so great. It's so good.
So anyway, here's the deal. Mr. J is really not up to a visit right now. He's not feeling himself.
He's not feeling himself.
Actually,
So
he
that's
was
the
earlier,
first
but
little
that's
symbol.
not what I meant.
He was earlier, but that's not what I meant. So that's the first little symbol or signifier that something's off with Joker, and that's assuming that you didn't watch any of the trailers or anything promoting the game, because that signaled a lot of this ahead of time. But the basic premise is that what we established in Batman Arkham Asylum will continue in this game. So the Joker got all kinds of screwed up from the Titan injections that he produced for that. He's still recovering from it, and he's just a total disaster afterwards. And it's one of the things I really appreciate about these Arkham games is that they're all very cohesive. What they established in the first game carries through to Arkham City, and then that carries through to Arkham Knight very, very well. And it's not that common that we get a trilogy that feels as though it follows one steady arc and everything ties together perfectly. And before somebody is like, well, what about Batman Arkham Origins? It's not in the same timeline. It's made by another studio. It's technically a prequel. So it's just all kinds of different. So I don't personally count that in the same way or as part of this same set of games, but it's still part of the series, even though it's not part of the trilogy. And there, we're at the clock tower. We climb on up and see what's up, because this is where the shot rang out that came into the courthouse. Oh,
There's that gun. It looks like it's being controlled remotely by Joker.
yeah, sure does. Sure does. Sure do-be-do. There he is.
Well, look who it is. I haven't seen you for... How long has it been? Let's see. There was an asylum, some monsters, and oh, that's right. You left me to die. Now, you
So
probably don't
notice
remember
his
that
face. So he's all scarred up. He doesn't look great. That'll be important here in just a little bit.
Hurry up now. Clock's ticking.
Clock's ticking. So obviously he set up a ton of bombs. That's significant because he totally could have just killed Batman in that moment. But instead he warned him. He let him get away, but he didn't have to. And I think that has a lot of really interesting narrative implications. You know, that the Joker could have just killed him. He could have just done what he's allegedly wanted to do all this time for years and years and years. But he chose not to, knowing that if he warned Batman, he would escape. Whereas he could have just had it so the second the flap opens, the trapdoor opens at the top of that, he instantly gets blown to smithereens. That could have been just fine. They could have done it, but instead he warns him. And I think that that's a really interesting narrative beat that was very intentional and has some interesting implications. So this is our first chance to really explore the city to our heart's content, and